Hi, everybody. Welcome to a brand new Film Music Media conversation. I'm sitting here with the amazing composer, Alex Heffes. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. It's so great to
Yeah,
sit down and do this with you.
we've been meaning to do it for a long time, so I'm glad that we've got to do it.
Absolutely. So, before we jump into it, I did want to, we just had the passing of the amazing Ryuichi Sakamoto, and maybe before we jump into it, I know you worked with him on your Face to Face album, which you just re-released this past year, kind of a new mix for it. So maybe, every time we lose a composer from the community, it's such a terrible loss. I'm just maybe, what was your experience working with him before we jump into kind of your stuff? I'd love to, hear that
Yeah,
experience.
yeah. Thanks for asking, because it was a really sad weekend. I mean, I knew he was ill, but even
Yeah.
when someone's ill, it's like sort of, it's just always a shock when someone goes. And I guess, I have just really happy memories of working with Rucci, and he was a very genuine and very straightforward guy, I found.
Yeah.
I asked him if he'd be interested in this face-to-face project. It was quite a few years ago, and as you said, we've just re-released it in. We did like spatial mixes as well, which was really fun. And I remember saying to Ricci, I really want to try improvising something together and just like capture something of the moment. The idea of the project was to find someone inspiring, and he was always a great inspiration to me, and
Yeah.
go to an inspiring place and like put those two things and see if you could just capture a moment where an idea sparked and you had some inspiration. And so I wanted to do it in New York City, and I turned up in Manhattan. I was in London at the time, and I flew to Manhattan, and we got to the studio and we set up two pianos, like a dueling pianos thing, and we were gonna like sort of feed off each other's ideas. And so I got there. Richie said, "Great. So, what have you got prepared? What ideas have you brought?" And I said, "No, Richie, remember I told you this was going to be like, in the moment." And he just burst out laughing. He said, "You're crazy, man." But he totally went with it. He was like, "Yeah, okay, yeah, that's cool." And that was the sort of, I found him to be that very generous sort of like, "Okay, that's great," sort of
Yeah.
spirit. And so we recorded a lot of material, and then I went away and shaped it into two songs. We did one song called Manhattan Rain, which we recorded during a huge one of those New York downpours that was so loud you could actually hear it on the studio roof. um,
Wow.
so we actually recorded some of the rain and recorded that into one of the tracks. And the other one, still doing this dueling piano thing, was I really love. It's called Free Flow, and it's a sort of minimalist type thing. And we added some guitars and bass and some other elements. And he seemed to really like what I did with it. But it's just all happy memories. So
Yeah.
I think that's the best way to look at it. Is when someone goes, especially in the music community, it's sort of unique that you leave something behind you. Great artists leave something behind, and I
Yeah.
was actually thinking about that today. Not so much, for myself, but it's just sort of an interesting part of being someone creative, that even though you're gone, you can still sort of impact people, and that's what Reach's passing has sort of left me just thinking about this weekend. So.
Yeah. I rewatched the trailer for his documentary Coda, and it's
Mhm.
kind of haunting because in that documentary he says, "I don't know how much time I have left, and I want to leave something meaningful behind." And I'm like, oh, that's just like hit me with his wave of
Yeah,
emotions. And it's like, you think about mortality and legacy, and but just also just your time here, the time that we have. So, um, and
yeah, that's
it's
true. And as you get older, I mean, I never really used to think about it, but now that I have a body of work behind me,
yeah.
you sort of, I feel, I've got lots of work to do. I'm not like I'm done. I've got
Right.
lots of
No,
music
not at
in me,
all.
but it's like, there's something that, my family would be able to know me by when I'm gone, or friends or something. It's sort of nice to think that, it may last, it may not last. I don't know, but it's sort of an interesting thing I've grown into as a composer. Is like sort of that thought. It's sort of
Yeah.
interesting just to ponder what that means.
Absolutely. Well, to kind of segue into talking about you, I think that's a perfect point to talking about what things mean. And I always like to start off with this question. of what does music mean to you, and you can take that question however you see it, as a storyteller, as a person, as a human being, as a musician. What does music mean to you, in whatever sense you make that question to be?
Well, that's quite a question. That's a deep one. I mean, I can't really tell you. I can remember as a child being quite mystified that the grown-ups around me sort of almost treated music in an almost religious sense, of like it was something so important to them and so sort of sacred almost, that
Yeah.
when I was a child I didn't quite, I was just like, yeah, I like music, and it's and it's good. But I remember thinking, I don't think about music like that, and I think I've come full circle now. And now I've got my own, I've got my own child and family. I find myself more and more thinking, just wow, how important this is to me, and how could I live without doing this? And so it's sort of satisfying to have come full circle. And I think you can only do that by living your life and doing stuff and coming to the realization. So I don't really know if that answers your question, but
Oh no, it does, absolutely. No.
it's definitely something I couldn't do without. I think it's so much part of my brain and my lifeblood, my
Yeah.
thought processes, that I can't imagine it not being there. But I remember a time when it wasn't, when I was younger. Although when you're younger, the whole world is new and you're soaking up everything, and yeah. So
Yeah, well, let's rewind back there. I'm curious. Do you remember? Was it like a point where it did enter your life? Did it come into your life gradually? When did music start becoming an interest? Whether it was early in childhood, later in childhood, adolescence. I'm curious, where in your life did it start kind of
yeah.
seeping in?
Well, actually, I remember very, very specifically. I went to a bookstore or a general store, and I won a raffle ticket. I can't remember what I bought, something, and I got a call afterwards saying, "Oh, you've won a prize." And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know there was a prize. I must have filled out some form." This was sometime
Yeah.
in the early 80s. And they said, "Oh, you've won a prize. You can come in and buy any cassette of any music that you'd like." I don't remember how I won this thing, but I remember going to the store, and E.T. had not yet come out. It was coming out that summer, but of
Oh, okay.
course, everyone knew about, this thing that was coming. We all knew it was going to be phenomenal, but we just didn't know what the heck it was.
Right.
And they just had the John Williams soundtrack cassette had just arrived in the stores just before the movie. And so I looked at that and I said, "Well, I'm definitely going to have that." And I took it home, and I was still pretty young, and I thought actually it was going to be like the story book on the cassette read to me. And so I put the cassette on thinking, "Oh god, I'm going to find out what the story of ET is." And no, it wasn't a story, it was just the music. And first of all I was like, "Oh, that's just the music, that's a bit odd." And but I carried on listening, and then as I remember just thinking, wow, this film sounds amazing. But
Yeah.
all I know about it is the music, and I listened to the whole thing over and over and over again. So by the time the movie E.T. came out, I knew the music backwards, because it was the only cassette I owned at that time,
Right.
because I was still pretty young. And I just remember, especially that cue with Elliot and E.T. with the harps, the two harp cue, where they're sort of in his bedroom and Elliot's showing him all the toys.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's such a, it's not one of the big thematic cues in the film, but even when I was 12 or whatever that age was, I just remember imagining what the film must be like with the music before I'd seen it. And I think that made quite an impression on me. And it obviously did, because I'm still talking about it today in a way.
Yeah, I had a very similar one because I was born in '87, so for me Jurassic Park was like, that
Right.
came out, and I remember my dad had a friend who worked in DC who had a record store, and they would give all the samples, all the hole punch samples back to him to take home, and I would always dig through and find the soundtracks. And I remember having I think I still have the cassette. I still have the Jurassic Park cassette, and I used to listen to that in my Walkman, sitting in the back seat, looking out the window, kind of picturing things, but not even seeing the movie yet. And I do remember
Right.
I did have the story. It was like a children's storybook for Jurassic Park. And when I saw the movie, eventually my parents decided like, oh, maybe it's too intense for him. I was only 6 when it came out.
Right.
So, but I took it in. I was like flipping the pages, to make sure the pictures matched up with what the movie was. And
Yeah.
then
Well, there
I
you
think,
go.
yeah,
You know what I'm talking about. It's the same thing. So
yeah,
that was fortuitous.
absolutely. So when did you see it becoming as a career choice? Was there a point in your life where you're like, okay, I'm going to pursue this? And what made you go with composition of composing this for visual media over all the other different musical careers you could have possibly had?
Right. Well, actually, I have a very specific memory again of being about 16, and my parents took me to like the career advice place where they you know they tell you which routes you might go. And I
Right.
remember the lady, she sat on a big desk and she said, "So, what do you want to be?" And I remember saying, "I want to be a composer." And I remember she literally took down a book and thumbed through it and went down to C, 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 C. She said, "No, it's not in the book. You can't do that. What else do you want to do?" And it's a true story. And I just remember thinking, well, that's stupid. Um, but okay. And I don't remember what else I said, but so it, these days you can go to college and you can become a movie composer.
Yeah.
Back then, I'm not that old, but it just wasn't a thing. It was like a dream, a lifetime away. The idea of, and I wasn't in the US as well. I wasn't living in Hollywood. I was
Right.
living thousands of miles away. So I didn't have any clear idea that it was conceivably something that you could do in real life, except I knew there were people that did it, but I had no clue how they'd got there, or it's not that I gave up on the idea, but I went off and got a musical education, and I never learned being a composer.
Hmm.
I went to university and I did quite an old-fashioned music degree, did lots of stuff with medieval manuscripts and doing harmony and learning to write fugues and all the good stuff. But I was told at university, no, you don't do composition because you'll get marked down, because no one gets good marks being a
Yeah.
composer. So I sort of had a split personality, because I was crazy about films. I used to watch films all the time. I was just terrible, terrible with it. And so I had this split personality where I loved film music, and I sort of loved secretly, all the stuff that wasn't allowed to be on the syllabus. I became very into jazz, but I couldn't say I liked jazz when I was at university, because that was sort of like, that's not real music. I couldn't say I like film music. That's not real music. So when after I graduated and all that stuff, I started thinking, well, how do you actually become a composer? And
Right.
I had no practice. I was messing around and doing stuff, on my own, and recording stuff, and I got Cubase version 1, on the God, it was even on the Atari ST, I think, at the time. And taught myself, it was the very, very first like iteration of sequences, and this was like really opened up a whole new world of being able to just play around and
Wow.
experiment with stuff. And because I'd done lots of sort of formal music education, but I never really learned to be a composer at all, which I'm sort of, in a way, I'm grateful for. But I
Yeah.
see a lot of the kids now who go to college, and their technical skill is really, really high, with writing. I was a lot more green, but I started picking up random jobs. I started doing short films. I never went to film school, but I figured it was much cheaper and easier rather than go to film school. I used to walk into the film schools and just look on the notice board in the foyer, and I'd just take down phone numbers, because everyone is always desperate for music, for music and
Right.
films.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I used to just phone them up and say, "I'm a composer. I'll do your music." And yeah, about 30 or 40 people called me and asked me to do music for their short films. So I got suddenly I had like an amazing crash course in writing, short films, and I put together a little show reel, and I had someone cut it together, and I mailed it out to about 100 different, places, like you do, or like
Right.
you did. You don't mail out anything these days. And out of those 100 things, I got 2 calls back. Both were from actually advertising agencies, and I ended up doing arrangements straight off the bat out of college for, especially for one guy who was very successful in commercials, but he didn't read or write music, but he was extremely good. and he needed someone to do orchestral arrangements, because in those days they were still doing like live orchestra on TV commercials.
Wow.
So, and honestly, I'd learned all about Debussy and Ravel and how to orchestrate, but quite honestly, I'd never done it at all, because until you've really done anything with real people, it's all sort of academic.
Yes,
And I remember
absolutely.
being pushed out in front of the orchestra, in my early 20s, because I was the one, who was supposed to be able to do this. And it was an amazing experience. For quite a few years, I was very, very young, and I sort of had a little bit of a hard time from some of the older, guard in the studio, understandably, who were slightly sort of like, who's this young guy? He doesn't know what the hell he was doing, and but I probably didn't. But so I really got to cut my teeth on writing for orchestras really early on, arranging, and then I was writing for these people a little bit as well. And that's an experience that obviously nowadays is much harder to come by, because we're using samples, and people don't have that luxury. So I was very, very lucky to end up doing that very young, and then I ended up, just quite by coincidence, becoming an assistant to a composer in London, who I was introduced to through absolutely no professional sort of link. It was just through a personal connection. Someone said, "Oh,
Was
you should
this
go and have a."
Simon Boswell? Is
This
that
was Simon Boswell,
okay?
yes. Yeah, and this was in the early 90s, and Simon was very busy. He was doing a lot of stuff, and I went round to have a career chat with him, because I'd been set up, to go and have a career chat, which is
Yeah.
great. And he gave me a VHS cassette, and he said, "Well, look, I'm doing this movie. Why don't you go home and write a scene for this movie?" It was a horror film, sort of action horror film. And so I said, "Yeah, sure." I went home and I got out my JV 1080, and I wrote some, action sequence. I thought it'd be very cool to do it in 7/8 for some reason. I was listening to lots of Jerry Goldsmith at the time, I think. And I took it back the next day, and he said, "Oh, great, well, you've got the job." And I said, "Oh, what job is that exactly?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm looking for an assistant." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I worked with him full time for 4.5 years from that day onwards.
Wow.
It was one of those like fortuitous moments that I wasn't really looking for, but it just happened, honestly, like that. And I was writing a lot, with Simon right from the beginning, a little bit in the same way that I'd said, well, I've been like doing this orchestration, and I've been conducting, and I was still really, really young. But
Yeah.
so with him, I got the opportunity to do a lot of writing, and we were at air, all the time, recording with big orchestras. And so he was very, very generous, and we had good times and fun times. And that's how I started getting my own movies eventually, because he was mainly doing movies, not really TV. And so
Right.
I met the producer, and I met the director, and and that sort of stuff. So it's one of those, when people ask me how you make your way as a composer, they never quite believe me when I tell this story, but it's sort of random and true, and everyone
Yeah.
finds their own way, and there's no
No
two
two. Like, I
routes
mean,
that
I've been interviewing composers for over a decade now, and when I ask that question, every answer is different, and that's what I love about it, because there's no
yeah.
textbook, there's no roadmap to do it. And I always go back to my friend Austin Wintory's explanation. It's like chiseling into a fence or a wall, and you finally break through, but once you do, that closes up, and nobody else can like take that path again. And I thought that was a great
Yeah, I
like
think that's
metaphor.
good. Yeah, although the way I think of it, it's like a horizon, and you think you've broken through and you've got to the horizon, but there's always a
Yeah,
little bit just across the across the, and that's what I've learned, growing up, that you set yourself goals and achievements, and
yeah,
as you acquire them, then bigger and better ones come up. But I actually
absolutely.
remember doing a talk years ago, and I was telling this same story, and someone put their hand up in the audience and said, "I know there's something you're telling us about how to become a composer. I just know there's something that you're not." I said, "Honestly, it's as it's as random and as different for every single person as you've just said,
Yeah, what are you
But
holding back, Alex? What are you
yeah, I know
what
there's like
secrets are you holding?"
what's some secret sauce you're not telling us?" But I think younger writers listening should take heart in that, because it's not like you have to find, you don't have to be in the right place or have some secret that I didn't know one single person in the film business or the music business when I
Yeah.
started. I literally didn't know anyone, and I was started cold calling, you know, and doing those show reels. And I always think that younger writers should really take heart from that, because I know that it can work if if you're persistent and you love it enough. And it's a very simple equation, actually, really, because it's just loving it enough and sticking it at it over a long period of time.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
long period of
and
time. That's the thing. It takes
it's
time.
the time is the that's like that's like that's the magic. That's the secret sauce, is just keep on going.
Yeah, I've been lately, we've been when I talk with composers, we cover that idea where it's like, yeah, you pick this career path, but it's like you see all your friends who went to business school and everything, and they're buying houses like right out of college, and having babies
Right.
young, and like cars, and you're just still in your 1 bedroom apartment trying to make trying to get it done. But honestly, I wouldn't trade it for the world. And I mean, I'm not a
Well, that's
composer, but I followed the filmmaking path. I went to film school and kind of did the same thing, and lived with friends. And then, yeah, I didn't know anybody when I came to LA. Didn't know a single human being. And somehow,
right.
it's great. I'm working at Warner Brothers and Cartoon
Yeah.
Network Studios. I had worked at Disney, and it's just like you just work and passion and good attitude, and be good to good to people, and things will happen. Yeah.
For sure, for sure. And just being someone that people like being in the room with is,
Yes,
just showing up, as they say, is a big part of it. And you'd be surprised how many people just don't show up.
I know. Reputations build very quickly, and very quickly. So if you're an asshole to somebody, people will know.
Right,
For sure.
exactly.
But let's I want to jump to, so you were working with Simon, and you started, and after Simon, you started getting your own projects and stuff. I'm curious, at that point in your life and your career, did you have like a voice as a composer yet, or were you still developing that? Were you developing a sound, or were you like, oh, I know what kind of composer I want to be? I know you were inspired by John Williams, and you were talking about Jerry Goldsmith, but like you were like,
Hmm.
oh, were you at that point? I'm sure you were just kind of taking what you could get for like work, but were you making any decisions like, oh, I really want to focus on this genre, and I really want to write this type of music? You talked about goals. I'm wondering if you set goals back then for yourself.
Yeah, I think so. And I think people, especially when you're younger, they tended to ask me what type of composer I was. And
Hmm.
I've always slightly flippantly given the same answer, which is, well, it's sort of not for me to say, it's for you to
Right. Okay.
hear
Okay.
it and and sort of decide. But I know myself what type of music. Yeah, I sort of like grew up listening to that stuff, the John Williams and the Jerry Goldsmith. But I also was I was very influenced by stuff in the 80s with synths that were coming along. I
Yeah.
loved Tangerine Dream, when that got used in a movie, in Risky Business, it was fantastic. It was like
Yeah.
so different. And those early scores, actually, of Hans's, the when Rain Man was really, really good, and
Oh yeah.
I really liked how he used synths there. So, but it is it's a very interesting question that you've just posed. What sort of composer you are and what your voice is, because when you're young, and to a certain extent all the way through your career, actually your body of work is always defined by actually what movies come along that you end up scoring.
Yeah.
To a certain
Yeah.
extent. And really good composers have a voice and they've got their style. And I'd like to think I know what my style is and I apply it to that, but you still have to apply that within what work comes your way. And so as I started working, I used to grumble that there were things I was asked to do, and I was like, well, this isn't the sort of music that I want to write.
Right.
But actually, of course, I look back now and I'm grateful for every single movie that I did, especially the ones that asked me to do something that I was grumbling about at the time, because it's great practice being able to
Yes.
do lots of different things, but also you learn how to apply your own voice and your own style to different things. And it is interesting looking back over a little bit, over some of the films I've done, that people have asked me to combine different elements. So I met Kevin Macdonald quite early on, and after I left Simon, I did his first movie, which was a feature doc called One Day in September.
Yeah.
and that was Kevin's sort of first film and my first sort of big film, and it won the Academy Award for feature documentary that year, which was sort of a big, you know, it was
Yeah.
exciting and a big deal. And then I went on with Kevin we did Touching the Void, which is an amazing climbing film. And then after that, we did Last King of Scotland. I did quite a few projects in between those with him as well. And for Last King of Scotland, I went out to Uganda and he wanted me to go out there and record a lot of material in Africa for the film, because he
Wow.
came from a lot of documentary and he felt it was really important to go out there as a composer as well and sort of collect stuff and work with it. And it's a phenomenal film, and it was an amazing experience. And I produced lots of the songs as well as writing the score in Last King of Scotland, because a lot of those songs from the 70s just aren't available on record. So we actually found a band who had played for Idi Amin in Uganda in the 70s, and I reproduced and remade some of their songs. And so after that, people started asking me to do scores that incorporated either world elements or sort of put together elements with orchestras, because the orchestra was sort of my background. But
Yeah.
I look back now and I can see people asked me to do a lot of I went on and did Mandela Long Walk to Freedom, which is, you know, also in Africa. And I've done lots of films set in Africa, or more recently, I worked with Anushka Shankar. We did A Suitable Boy, Vikram Seth's book, with Mira Nair, the always brilliant Mira. I love her. And it's, you know, it's just sort of interesting that people have sought me out to combine. I think I've always found that when you hear in movie music, sometimes music from other parts of the world or different genres, they're quite often jammed in with an orchestra in not
Mm.
the most subtle way, not the
Yeah,
most
no.
subtle way,
Yeah,
if you know
absolutely.
what I mean. I mean, it's there are great exceptions to that rule, but it's always struck me that I'd really like to try and find a way of combining those different elements. So people have asked me to do those hybrid scores a lot. And turns out that I wasn't an expert at doing it. You know, when I first went to Africa, I didn't, you know, I was just making it up on the fly, as you do.
Yeah.
But I've been asked to do it so many times now that I guess I work with people. I like working, you know, with people. I like doing sessions where we'll record something, then I take it away and I'll chop it up and sort of find some little thing that just really catches my ear and is interesting, and then I'll find a way of combining that with the orchestra or whatever we need to do to make it into something that makes sense, rather than it just being two things jammed together. So
Right.
that's been definitely one defining part of my voice as a composer, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I know that kind of became, you know, part of your voice for sure. But what I love about your filmography is just it's so diverse, and I think it shows your versatility across so many different genres. And you got to, I mean, you got to work with so many different filmmakers and so many different stories and different tones and different, you know, styles of filmmaking. So I'm curious. I know this is probably going to be dependent on the specific project, but I'm curious for you. I mean, we're talking about your process in general. Where does the first note come from for you? Where do you like to go for that first point of inspiration? Do you like to, if you're working with somebody that you know and you're on early enough, do you like to read the script? Do you just like to have a conversation with the director? Do you like to wait for that first lock picture? Do you like to, or as you said, you know, get sent to the location or Uganda to be amongst the setting of the film? I mean, where do you, if you had your, you know, your wish list to pick of, where do you love to go to first to kind of generate that first idea?
Well, it's all of those, isn't it? Really,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I think it is very dependent on the chemistry you have with that director. I think
Mm,
some directors really want you on early, and they'll want to send a script. And yeah, working with Kevin Macdonald, for example, you know, I would write when we did State of Play. I was writing music a year before, you know, before I
yeah.
probably even saw any picture. Um, and there are other times when you're brought on 3 weeks before, you know, you're dubbing. So
Right. Yeah.
you do have to, as you well know, you know, you have to be very nimble and just adapt to whatever the scenario is. But and I think part of it also is getting under the skin of the director and trying to understand what makes her or he tick musically, what they might really not like as well. You know, a lot of people come to music with a lot of anxiety and a lot of sort of quite a lot of baggage, you know, because it's taste. You know, music just does come down to personal taste,
Yeah,
and
subjective. Yeah.
it's totally subjective, and it's very, very hard to describe. And so a lot of directors, I find, are very anxious about
Mm.
music for whatever reason. Some people feel like they don't have the vocabulary to talk about it, and I would say that's the least interesting thing for me, because
Right.
who cares about vocabulary? You know, we're trying to tell a story, so I want you to talk to me like an actor. You know, what's the mood of
Yeah,
this
you're the
film?
translator. That's your job. You know, you're just
That's right.
yeah.
Exactly. You don't need to tell me whether it's going to be pizzicato or on a flute or something. I mean, you're welcome to if you want to, but let's just talk about storytelling and about pace and about how you want the audience to feel at the beginning of the movie,
Mm.
or at the end. And I like talking in very broad terms and then narrowing it down. But in terms of actually writing, yeah, it's, you know, I try and suss some of these things out, and there are some movies that I write very, very quickly. I just have an idea and I go for it, and there are other ones that you know, you go round in circles a little bit, sort of chipping away, trying something. And sometimes it's dependent on how well the film is already working, or what state of construction, you know, it's in.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, and I've learned also not to be dogmatic about it, because really you need to adapt. I know what my working style is, you know, as I said, but you
Yeah.
have to adapt to how that director works. And like when I worked with Stephen Frears on his Lance Armstrong film, The Program, at first I was really confused, because I'd write music and send it to Stephen, and he'd say, "Oh, yeah, I like it, dear boy." So, but and then I'd go and watch the film, and he'd put that cue in a different scene, you know, not the scene I'd write it for. And I'd say, like, you know, at least 50% of the music in that film, all the cues got swapped around in different scenes, and it was sort of, at first I was like, well, okay, fine, what? But actually, it was sort of interesting, because you know, you have someone's take on what that music does, and then I would take it away and I would say, okay, well, it does work there, and how
Yeah.
about if I do this and I try this and I try this. It was a really interesting way of working. I've done movies where I've just written music without seeing any picture to a script, and an editor or music editor will try taking a couple of bits and putting it on the front credits or here and there. And I think when I was younger, I was a lot more what's the word, you know, I was trying to hang on to every detail, and
Mm.
now it's quite interesting to just, you know, you need to let people into your process to a certain extent, which I think only comes with confidence and knowing what your process is and knowing what, you know, who you are, but allowing people to yeah.
Was it hard to find confidence? I mean, I always dealt with self-doubt, and I know other artists maybe have doubt and feeling like, okay, maybe you know, I don't have what it takes. But did you always have that confidence, or did you have to work to kind of to become a confident storyteller and collaborator?
Well, I was very lucky, as I was saying earlier, to be working with Simon Boswell, who is, you know, a busy and well-known composer,
Yeah.
at the time, and I sat in on all the, you know, the meetings with the directors and the producers early on, and so I got to sort of see someone else, you know, project their confidence,
Mm.
and then afterwards see their you know, see the flip side of it. And you know, when the door closed and the director's gone, you know, you
Panic.
know, yeah, see the panic side of it, which is
Yeah.
part of being a composer. You know, that's
Right.
every, you know, every great composer will have exactly the same panics, you know.
Confident in the
So
room, panic by yourself.
yeah, of course, that's the process. It doesn't matter how experienced or, you know, famous you might be. I'm absolutely sure that's a common thread. So I guess that was a good education. So I learned how to try and show confidence, and I think I think people do hire you because they want you to have a point of view about their movie. They also want
Right.
you to
Yeah.
do what they want.
Hmm.
But I always think it's important to listen to exactly what someone is asking you and give them what they want, but also give them what you think is right. Because if you don't do what you really feel inside is working for you, you're not going to do your best work. It's just not going to be. So, it's important to marry those two things. And I always feel like it's important to give the director something extra than they were asking for. Sometimes people come with a very specific idea and they want something, and even if it's really
Yeah.
specific, I want to try and find some point of view or something that just is more. And sometimes they listen and they go, no, I don't like it. But sometimes they go, wow, I wasn't expecting that. But yes, that could be
Yeah.
good. So that's my take on my take on it.
And you mentioned so we talk about working with directors, and you mentioned Stephen Frears, but Kevin Macdonald, but he's also worked with like Mikaela Hofstrom and Peter Weber, and of course Catherine Hardwicke, which you just scored Mafia Mamma with, and you've done multiple films with all those directors. So I'm curious, how does when you're working with a filmmaker like that across several projects, where is it easier the more you work with somebody, or is it like from that first, do you remember like the first time you've worked with me? We can take Catherine for an example. The first time you worked with her, how is it different than now with Mafia Mama? Is there a shorthand, or is it like, does she know you too well? Is it harder to kind of get? I'm curious what do you see across several
Well,
projects?
I think it cuts both ways actually, and I'm sure there'd be composers who will tell you that. I think working with a director over a series of movies is a great thing. I think it's one of the great pleasures of being a composer, because you
Yeah.
can sort of cut to the chase a little quicker, because there's a sort of getting to know you, phase
Yeah.
to scoring a film.
Like any relationship, but you have to
like
get some.
any like
Yeah.
any relationship. But like any relationship, you don't want to get into a sense of complacency,
Yeah.
and I think that sometimes that can happen between directors and composers. um, I tell you, I had a very interesting experience years ago. I worked with Tim Burton on Sweeney Todd, when he
Right.
on his adaptation of Stephen Sondheim's show, which is an amazing film. It's so perfect for Tim.
Yeah.
And so it was one of those films that Danny wasn't on, because it was, it just wasn't, it was already a show. So, and I came on to adapt some of the music and do some of the arrangements and write some additional score of that. And I was nervous because it was sort of Tim, but also
Right.
because he had that relationship with Danny Elfman already for forever. And so I was, just to your point of when a composer and a director know each other really well, I was concerned that how would I sort of know what he was asking for, because maybe he was just so used to it. So I don't really know how he works with Danny at all, and I never
Yeah.
asked. But Tim he would just listen to something that I did. He would come around to my place and listen to me, say, "Yeah, I like it. Just make it a little bit more." And he'd just like shake his hand, like a bit more, and that would be it. That's all I would get. um, and that stuck in my mind as like, oh well, you know, maybe he's just used to having such a shorthand with someone that
Right.
it's sort of, after it doesn't really come out in words in a way. And it's sort of with directors I've worked with a lot, I've noticed that they do develop shorthand ways of sort of, they'll sort of say, what I mean, but
Right.
sometimes you don't actually know what they mean. But and sometimes they maybe they know what they mean, but they don't quite know how to say it. And that's where music is obviously infuriating and extraordinary, because it defies words. you
Yeah,
know
absolutely. Yeah. There's no, yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, when you're presenting to a director, when you're, sending work in to be, approved or checked out, are you at this point in your career, do you still get like nerves about presenting something new, or do you get excited to show off and be like, hey, look
yeah,
what I made? Like, I'm
it's
curious.
it's 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 hideous. It's always hideous playing something for the first time, to directors that well. it's I mean, it's exciting,
Yeah.
but it's very nerve-wracking. But I've learned that well, what have I learned? I've learned that it doesn't really matter if not every single thing you play them, it hits the bullseye every time.
Right.
It's about what you take from their reaction and what, and then work with it. And I mean, most of the time you do play stuff and it goes down pretty well. You have to learn to be thick-skinned. Sometimes people sometimes say things that they don't quite mean. I actually quite like people to be very honest. I think one of the interesting things that's happened in more recent years as we've been doing more remote presentations, obviously through the
Yeah.
pandemic and even before, is that um, there was a long period where the director wouldn't be in the room with me here, we'd be remote. And I used to find that very nerve-wracking because you don't even get any body language. You can't sort of feel what
Yeah.
the response is in the room. But in a way that I think that cuts both ways, because I think it's quite difficult to determine people's responses and to be able to work together on something. But at the same time, it does give that person the opportunity to really listen to the music in their own environment and sometimes be able to sort of digest it in their own time and come back and
Yeah.
sometimes give you feedback that you feel actually might be more almost more useful because they're not on the spot. They don't feel like they've sort of had to suddenly give you
Yeah. Or even
feedback. So
sugarcoat it, or like they can sit with it some more, and they can be more a true reaction to
yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah. So it's it's not ideal, but it can, there can be an upside like to anything.
Yeah.
But honestly, it's still great to be able to have directors come in and just to be able to, quite often, you'll have an experience where you'll play something and the director's really not sure about it, and they say, well, how about if I take the trumpet out, or how about if we do this, or just that, and then all of a sudden it clicks for them and they go, oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So having the confidence not to just panic if someone's not jumping up and down for joy, and just get to the bottom of what it's not doing for them. And quite often it's something quite simple that can be done, and all of a sudden everything falls into place.
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned Catherine Hardwicke, which you worked on
Yeah,
several projects with. I want to jump into Mafia Mamma, which is a
yeah.
fantastically fun, I mean, amazing movie starring Toni Collette, who's one of my favorite actresses, and
Right.
I get Monica Bellucci in there. I mean, it's just a fantastic, fun film. So I'm curious. This is almost like a self-aware comedy about the kind of mob movie genre. So
Yeah,
you have the genre that has baggage. Even they reference Godfather like in the movie, like it's like Godfather, and she's like, I haven't
yeah,
seen it, so it's
yeah.
like so I'm curious, what were the conversations you had with Catherine at the start of this, and what did you talk about tone and about the style of the movie, and what the role of the music was going to be, and what did you end up, I
Yeah.
guess, implementing?
Yeah, and as you say, this is a third picture I've done with Catherine now. They've all been actually quite different,
Yeah, very much.
which which is great. I love that. I love the variety. As it turns out, I think Catherine is a natural comedy director, and in a way,
Yeah.
it's not that surprising because she's, as a person, she's very funny, and she's like just a very, very fun person always to be with. So it doesn't surprise me that she's really good at comedy.
Right.
But I could tell immediately that I saw it that it was very funny. And as you say, Toni Collette is just so,
Oh,
I don't
she's
know,
so
she's
good.
just so likable and
Yeah.
just, it's just sort of effortless. She's such a good actor. Um, Catherine did from the beginning say that she really wanted to, The Godfather is this, it's sort of a running gag in the film. And so, yeah, she wanted to make the movie a little bit like a homage to that. But I've always thought of it a bit more like The Godmother, really, in a way.
Yeah.
Because, it's Tony's movie, and there are lots of pictorial references to The Godfather. But Catherine said, I'd love to have like a very Godfather type theme. And she really wanted it on the trumpet. She wanted that full, sort of Godfather vibe to it. So that was the first thing I did, was to write, um, to write that to the script. Actually, it was just before they finished filming, so I hadn't
Oh,
actually seen
wow.
anything. um,
How do you even
um,
approach something like that? Because you're coming to, I mean, do you immediately try, reference Nino Rota? Do you immediately try to capture that and people will kind of recognize it, or you try to create something that's you but in that world?
Well, I deliberately didn't go back and listen to The Godfather,
Mm,
and I've always done that. Like when I scored Roots, when they did the reboot of Roots, I deliberately didn't go back and watch the original because I sort of, I certainly didn't want to copy it, and I wanted
yeah,
to sort of take my, if I was going to do a tip of the hat in Mafia Mamma, I wanted to do it from what I felt about The Godfather, rather than going back and watching and studying the movie
right,
and
right.
doing it that way. Um, so I didn't go back and watch them, but it's just, just just how I felt it might work. And I think just staying very light is really important in comedy. But I do think that audiences, and you'll know really well about this actually, audiences can like smell funny music a mile off. It's
Yes.
you know
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
It's so in comedy you've got to, and Catherine sort of agreed that we don't want to try and actually be funny. I think it just playing it straight um, would probably work much better than trying to be too sort of comedic. So I always kept things light, and even in the action sequences, didn't want to get too intense or heavy because it is a comedy. So just
Right.
balancing how much bass there is or how much driving percussion, and trying to use lots of high ends using. So I like to think about palettes a lot and what are the colors you're going to use. So using that trumpet and accordion, and we put together a really fun little band of trumpet and accordion and like dulcimers and mandolins, all the Italian tropes, if I'm honest, but
Right, yeah.
really, really fun because they've all got brilliant color and they've all got really good character. And then those get put together with the orchestra, but trying to find what the balance is so that it's not all big and orchestral, but it can actually stay quite light on its feet. Um, and that's
So,
really how I started thinking about it.
so when you talked about not, you don't want to be too comedic with the music, how do you, I guess, as a composer, navigate those like specific comedic moments, whether it's a line of dialogue or if it is an action, more of a situational action comedy or something like that, or something somebody falls or it's a gag, light turning on or off, how do you stay away from it, and or how do you, I guess, navigate it and make sure that the score isn't Mickey Mousing or being too, stuff like that? I'm curious. Do you
Yeah.
just completely stay away from it and let the editing work, or do you try to do something?
Um, I think, well, a lot of it is intuition, and I think a lot of
Mm,
it is reading the performances and seeing, and that goes for any genre in a way. But comedy is very specific because you're aiming for a laugh, you're aiming for something really, sort of
yeah.
very, very specific. So trying to read the performances and see where you feel the funny parts really are, where it's really working, and then figuring out, okay, that line is actually delivered really, it just works really well, so I should steer clear of that and
Mm,
let Toni just deliver that without music and clear it. Or another one where maybe the comedy's implied but the line isn't so clear and you need to sort of just point it up in a gentle way with the music.
right, right.
Certainly in action sequences, just that's a little bit more like ballet, I think. Especially action comedy, it needs to be very, very nimble and needs to be able to like turn on a dime and not really get too heavy or sort of thunderous, because it needs to go from being like exciting and pounding in what and 2 bars later all of a sudden it's just gone to some other totally different thing because that's the
Right.
nature of that genre. So it's a lot of it is to do with rhythm and pace. And the film's got a great editor as well, and a lot of
Yes.
that comes from editing. I always remember listening to Jerry Goldsmith talking about how he starts writing music is to just look at the pace of cuts, how many cuts there are in a scene, and that you can usually feel a BPM or a sort of a tempo that just fits with how fast something is sort of cut. And that, I think that's very true as well. He's finding the right speed. These are all things that, as you know, for composers, it does come with practice and it's quite
Sure.
intuitive. But when
Yeah.
you actually think about it, what you're doing is pretty much looking at the pace of the cuts and feeling out what BPM fits with that, first of all, in a sort of a very if you're really getting down to brass tacks, it's nitty gritty,
Yeah.
that's where you're starting, certainly with action and comedy. How
Well, I think
fast or slow, how loud or quiet does this need to be?
right. So if and I don't know, did they use a did you have a temp? Did Catherine use a temp with the edit on this, or was it like temp free?
There was some temp, but actually not a great deal, because she was really keen, as I said, for me to write a theme early on, and then by the time I watched the first cut, I wrote a theme for each of the two warring families, the Balbanas and the Romanas, and I wrote a couple of different variations. I did a trumpet version and I did a guitar version, and a couple of, and Waldo, the editor, is really good. When I watched the first cut, he'd already placed them, where he felt they worked, and I was like,
Wow.
yeah, that's that. So that was almost like a music editorial sort of part of the process that was already done a little bit by the time I came on set. I was able, I'd rewrite those things, but with the knowledge that they basically.
But yeah, it prevents them from having to, because you mentioned finding the pacing, and I know as a visual person myself, I love music to inspire ideas, but also when you're editing it dictates the pace of a scene sometimes if you need it. So, but if you use a temp, it's almost locked to whatever that music is. But the fact that you were on early enough that you could provide, your music, they were locking pictures to your music, so it was much, I think, more organic and natural for you to just come in and make that, and then
Yeah,
conform it and make it work. Yeah.
yeah, and maybe knowing Catherine, fairly well from doing, other movies with her, then it's a little bit more like you get a little bit more leeway. And as I said, it
Yeah.
always comes down to that personal chemistry. So it yeah, it was fairly easy actually from that point of view. And then the fun came with the actual recording, because with that little band, you have the chance to really sit down, and we sort of blocked out a week where we would have each person come in individually, and we would do just the accordion one day and just the percussion on another day and build it up. But with this type of music where you're really going for character, then it's a chance to work with the players, and obviously everything was already, the charts were there and everything was there, but then you could sort of say, well, how can you do this that sounds, a little funnier, or how can you do this as a bit more straight, or is there something you can do on that instrument that just has got something wacky to it, and so
Right.
that was a really fun process.
So when you mentioned that it was like a little a band, and you were picking, like kind of picking out those iconic Italian instruments. So as a composer, I'm curious about the players of those instruments. I mean, are you looking for players to, bring themselves into their performance? And if you're working with an, accordion player, are you asking them like, hey, try something more playful, try something here, and they maybe, is there any improvisation at all, or is it kind of following what you wrote?
I mean, it's pretty much following what I wrote, but yeah, it's always best to just leave a few percent of chance in anything, because a really great player is going to do something,
Yeah.
they've spent their lifetime, perfecting how they do something. So it's great always when someone brings something unexpected, to the table. But I was, you need to have enough of a plan that everything is already
Right.
basically sort of
Right.
worked out. But yeah, for sure, especially with some instruments, percussion, is one that you can do. You could, it's like you could just go down a rabbit hole of
Oh, sure.
experimenting and never
Yeah.
come out. But that's a fun, but that's a fun thing. Um, yeah, all of them. I think that's one of the amazing things about being a film composer as well, is you really get to work with, sort of the best players there are in their fields. It's,
Yeah.
whether it be orchestras or just, doing a solo trumpet or accordion, you can. I like to handpick the people I work with. I work with a couple of contractors I've worked with forever, and we look really carefully if I need to find new people. I always listen to them a little bit beforehand to make sure that it's always going to sound good, but whether I think there's something that that person might be able to give me that
Yeah.
I'm looking for.
I
That
mean, you're like a director, casting a role. I mean, you're
right,
casting your orchestra and the players.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that must be such a fun process as a composer to kind of find the nuances in people's abilities and be like, oh, this would be perfect and that would be perfect. That must be just a joy to bring all those people together.
Yeah, and it may come back again to my history of going out recording stuff, in the field
Yeah.
and working with it and working with people on the fly. Probably there is something to that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the film is fantastic. The score is it's just wonderful, and it's such a treat. And it's I mean it's just a great time. It's just one of those films that's just a fantastic time.
Oh,
So
well,
congrats.
that's great. It's really nice to do something that's just straight up entertaining, and
Yeah,
if it
yeah,
makes people laugh, that's just, that's job done. It's great.
yeah. Absolutely. Well, as we kind of wind down, I want to talk about we were talking about before we started recording, kind of how the industry has been changing. So I'm curious, the ground is shifting underneath us all the time with everybody. So I'm curious, in your point of view, being in this industry as long as you have, what are some good things that are happening right now, and maybe what are some maybe not so good things that are a bit worrying that you're seeing?
Right. Well, I remember when I got first pushed out in front of those orchestras, like we were talking about earlier, in the early 90s, that players were telling me then that it was the end of the world and that
Mm,
music was going down the tubes and film was going down the tubes. And when I look back now, they had budgets that seemed like, like the golden years
right.
compared to that. So I've sort of learned that, much as things do seem, tough sometimes, and they are tough, but it's all relative, and as long as we're still working, it's good.
Yeah,
I
for
don't want to
sure.
seem flippant, but honestly, people were telling me back then it's all over, and that
Yeah,
was
yeah,
25 years ago. And if you look back to the mid 70s, they were saying it's all over for live orchestras, and it's all synths, and no one's going to be, and then Star Wars came along, and it, just blew that idea out of the water, really. So,
right.
you just never know what's going to happen, I think, is
Very
what I'm
true.
trying to say. So it's hard to give perspective when you're really close to it. I mean, at the
Mm,
moment,
yeah,
streaming
yeah,
is obviously the big thing, and it's a big it's been a huge mind shift for everyone in all sorts of different ways. But where that's actually going, I don't know, because it changes so fast from year to year. One minute Netflix is like not wanting to spend anything, and then they're making $150 million movies, and the next minute they're not wanting to spend anything. It's just hard to even keep up with it. So
yeah,
it's very unknown, I think. I've done movies a lot of my career. I've done TV, but I think the bulk of what I've done has been more sort of theatrical movies, and that's obviously changed in the last few years.
very
And I've
much.
done
Yeah,
much more TV, or streaming stuff, or miniseries. That's a big difference, and I don't know where that's going to go. If I had to make a guess, I would guess that cinemas aren't going anywhere, movie theaters aren't
no,
going anywhere, but it is getting really expensive, to go to the movies, for regular
yeah,
people. It's just like crazy. When
I know.
we were kids, it was like the cheap thing that you could go and do to amuse the kids. But so it's obviously become more of a premium experience, and people are going to theaters for the true spectacle, and for a premium experience of seeing and hearing everything really, really great, much better than you could at home. So my guess is that that will continue. But in terms of music, it's hard to say. I think things have really there's lots of good music around, actually. There's lots of really good music around.
Yeah, I think there's
I think,
a lot of new voices. I think that's the great thing, is that there's so many new voices, and then technology is getting more accessible, and we're
yeah,
hearing just a lot more perspective than just the isolated group of people who are kind of working, 15 years
yeah,
ago.
it is. I think so. I think it is fresh, and it's quite exciting, and sort of just makes me smile a bit when people sort of say it's so important to hear diverse voices. And I'm like, well, yeah, well, I've been mentoring female composers for the last 15 years.
Yeah,
Welcome to the party, folks. Um, and I've been out, recording people in Africa for the last 15 years or something. It's like,
right.
welcome to the party. Not that I necessarily know better than anyone else, but it's like, it's not a huge surprise to me that this new diversity in composers is exciting for people, because
Yes.
it's, you know, obviously is.
Yeah, very much.
You know, and people ask me the question about this quite a lot, and I think, you know, that I think I've admired good composers all my life, and I've admired composers who have been very diverse, and I think that's why I've wanted to be very diverse in the type of movies I write. But honestly, my just opinion is that it doesn't matter if you're female or male or what color you are, you know, as long as everyone gets a chance to write something, then, you know, good, you know, then good music you'll be able to then judge what good music is, you know. You know, because music speaks for itself. But, you know, just everyone having the opportunity to do it is got to be a good thing. So I think that's been one of the big things. Just, you know, just opening it up a bit has been good, I think, for everyone. I think the flip side of that is that there are so many composers now that you know, people will be willing to work for, you know, very different terms to what they used to.
Yeah.
And so I give a lot of career advice to younger composers and try and just sort of just help them sometimes just have the confidence to not give all their rights away, and all these things, you know, which people are being pressured into doing for all sorts of different reasons, because there's such a huge throng of composers wanting to, you know, work, which is, that's the good side. The bad side is that everyone is sort of being, you know, beaten down to the
Where they'll
to
just,
the
you know,
bottom.
if I go do it for, you know, they'll do it for exposure and that'll get me in, and but then
Yeah,
everyone gets used to, like, oh, I don't have to pay composer, I don't, they'll just do it, you know, get a younger composer to do it for free, and it's just like that devalues the whole profession, it devalues what the music is, you know.
right, exactly. And so I would never put someone down for doing that, because, you know, you've got to do what you've got to do to get yourself
Sure.
in front of people.
Yeah.
But I just really urge younger writers to not devalue themselves and keep a sense of their own value, because in the long run, you've got to have a long career. You've got to be able to build up a body of work, and that hopefully will pay your way and pay your living and and sustain you through your whole career. So
Yeah.
keep your sense of worth, and hold out when it makes sense to, and if it doesn't, then don't, you know. But these are all conversations that everyone is figuring out on the fly.
Yes,
And
because it's happening
we're all
happening so
figuring it out.
fast. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you know. But we'll probably look back in 15 years and say these were the golden times. Who knows?
Yeah. When AI takes over everything. So
Yeah, maybe. Although I think that some algorithms will become a bit like pop stars, that they will probably sort of like, they'll probably come up with something catchy. But I still think there's an element of people like the human behind the creator,
yes.
you know, the creation as well. I think there is an element. It's just human nature. We like to have heroes and heroines who create the things that we love as well.
Yeah.
And so, you know, great as AI is, I don't think it's quite gonna dispense with
Yeah.
composers and writers and artists. You know,
I
I think
remember.
it's just going to add to it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the conversation when like motion capture came out. People were like, oh, it's going to replace acting. Actors, you know, when Avatar came out, we won't need actors anymore. It's like, Avatar is a great spectacle, but yeah, you're not going to be able to replace, you know, actors, you know. So just like
Right.
you're not going to be able to replace, you know, storytellers and musicians and directors and editors, and having that one thing that you know, computers don't have, which is just humanity behind it. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
for sure. Well, Alex,
So,
we covered so much today. I want to thank you so much for your insight and your time. And it was such a wonderful time talking with you and getting to know all about your process and diving into your work. And so I want to thank you so much for sharing everything. Yeah, thank you so much.
yeah, it's my pleasure. It's been great to talk, and we'll let's talk in 10 years' time and see if any of these predictions have come about.
Sounds good.
Hopefully before then, in fact.
Yeah, we'll do it. We'll do it. We won't wait 10 years to talk.
Yeah, exactly.